Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host, Rich Gear, here as well. And we have our guest back with us, Ian Juby, to talk with us. What you call the red record. And I'm pretty excited about this because I know you're going to tie into a lot of stuff, even with creation evolution stuff. Things do tie in together. So
it's about the Native American flood or Native Canadian, all right, flood stories, and we can talk about our First Peoples. What is the terminology that is in vogue now?
It's funny because when I was researching all this, apparently I have Native heritage. Apparently I'm from the Mohawk, so as I'll explain, I've been researching this extensively, trying to dig into not just that, but also for what I'm about to share with both the kids show and my involvement in education with the First Nations people, right? So currently the politically correct terminology is First Nations, but I was actually I was having supper with a lady who's First Nations herself, and she's a counselor on the Nipissing Reserve here, not far from my place. And she was like, I don't know. I didn't get the last memo. I don't know what they're calling us now. So I think it's First Nations, but I'm not sure. So I mean, it's like, and I talk about that with like my cousin is my first cousin's a card carrying Indian status card carrying Indian, and the people who call them Indians are Indians. Yep.
They call them Indians. Call themselves Indians. Okay, good.
It's hilarious because and it's slightly annoying because when I first started talking about what I believe the Lord was doing, what the Lord was leading me to do with the First Nations people, I got a whole mess of pushback from all white people defending the First Nations people, and you're going to offend them. But nobody would ever tell me exactly in what way I was going to offend them. It was really frustrating because these were, most of them were friends of mine. This wasn't strangers, and it was quite frustrating at first, to be honest. But it's like this Laura is her name, actually, the counselor. And actually, I'm going to show some of her artwork because she is a fantastic artist as well. But she even said, she was explaining the protocols for how to meet like the chiefs and the elders and whatnot, and she encouraged me to do that as part of everything I'm about to share. And she was saying, wait till you meet the chief here. He's whiter than you. And she's right. He is.
Well, Ian, it's funny, but I just retired from the museum, and when I had to do some Native American, we had just last September, and we went up to in central Michigan. There's a whole lot of tribes, the Potawatomi and the Ojibwa and all, and there were several Native people. And they go, and I was trying to get some imagery because I had to do a mural. And he said, well, we go from very light to very dark. We run the gamut like everybody else. But I was talking to them and went through their museum, and they had a creation story. And I said, so this is what the creation story is? He goes, well, the guy looked at me with this little sheepish grin. He says, well, it's what we could agree on. Because every tribe has a different take, and they slightly, and it's what they can actually come together and say, okay, we can accept this or this, but they're quite a bit different in a lot of respects. And it reminds me of something Doug and I have done when you've read some of that one book we've reviewed a couple of times. We talked about Red Earth, White Lies. We got out in Grand Canyon. Yeah. Yes. Have you read that book?
Yeah, I haven't read the book, but I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, and it's really good because he spends a lot of time telling this is not a creationary book. Yet a lot of the stories he's talking about back up what biblical stories are telling you from Noah's, a lot of it's very, very, very interesting.
Well, he says that the Bible verifies
them, yeah,
their stories.
So anyway, but I thought that was a very much of a wake up call for me. Oh, you mean the tribes are as divided as we are? So anyway, that's just.
I'm glad you brought that up because we're gonna touch on that a little bit.
Okay.
because, as you already pointed out, hundreds of cultures, isolated cultures around the entire planet, all have creation myths and legends and flood myths and legends.
Yes.
And here in North America, did you catch the term Turtle Island when you were talking with these guys by chance?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
They say that about Mackinac Island in the Straits of Mackinac.
Okay, they're actually referring to all of North America.
Yeah.
So the whole North American continent is considered Turtle Island, and that's cross cultural. That's in multiple First Nations cultures, which you're going to see. And I think one of the clues comes from the Seneca tribe, which I mentioned in the previous shows. But it's how I wound up here. It's hilarious because this I've been working on. As you guys know, I've been producing Genesis Week for 11 years now. I haven't produced a show in about a year, but that's because I've been working on a children's show. It's an animated show. It's a creation science show. It's specifically going to be science education from a biblical perspective for children. And it's basically myself and 5 super genius kids. And we all camp out at a place called the Tech Valley Science Center. And even how I came up with that name, I have to go back a long ways, because when I was 16 years old, I was at the science fair. I had built a robot from stuff I found in the dump, literally. And I built this arm robot from scratch. And this guy by the name of Wayne Campbell came up and was really impressed and talking with me back and forth. And him and his wife were just starting a summer science camp. And they, so far as we know, it was the only camp of its kind in the whole world at that time. About 10 years later, after they started it, they started popping up all over the place. We heard about one over in Russia, but I mean, this was the days before the internet, right? So I mean, the only information we had was magazines and newspapers and stuff, right? Wayne and Carol were just fantastic people, but that's how I wound up teaching science and tech. I started when I was 16 years old, and it was at this science camp, and it was a world-renowned science camp, and I was there for 21 years. I was Wayne and Carol's right-hand man. I lived with them for several of those years. Every summer I was there for 21 years at least. And people brought their kids literally from all over the world to that science camp. And I learned how to teach, which was really important. And the way Wayne and Carol did things, it was unique. And I'm going to bring up their names a lot here because it plays into this story heavily. Like even the name of the camp, Hyla, that's actually an Algonquin word. It's Hyla Sila. And Wayne was very patriotic Canadian. He had the Avro Arrow flying over his head when he was a kid, when they were doing the test flights in Southern Ontario. And I mean, that was the pride of the nation, right? I mean, that jet would still outstrip most jet fighters in the air today, and that was 1950s technology. So he was a very patriotic Canadian, and he wanted a very Canadiana name for the camp. And he encountered this word Hyla Sila, which was an Algonquin word for like the creative force in a person. And so it stuck with him. So he called the camp Hyla. And so now here we are, I won't say how long, but we're many years later. Actually, Wayne, I'd totally forgotten he'd even done this. So this past year, I've been endeavoring to learn as many First Nations languages as possible. And the Algonquin Reserve, which is not far from here, the Golden Lake Reserve, I'd had multiple people instruct me to go onto the reserves as I'm trying to work forward and progressing with the kids show and with the science and technology education. And so I started looking up the Algonquin language, And lo and behold, I find this online dictionary of the Algonquin language on the Hyla Science Camp website. And I had totally forgotten Wayne had done this. So this was back in the early days of the internet. This is like 1997, I think, is when he started this project. And so he was trying to preserve the Algonquin language. And so he was recording people saying the words. He was building this audio library, which was new at the time. I still remember kind of helping him out with it because we were in great discussion over what file formats to use, because this was the early days of the internet. Everything was dial-up. And these audio files were just huge by comparison at that time, right? MP3 wouldn't come out for a few years yet. So everything was wave format, right? So stuff like that. It's just, but what I want to bring home there for any of the First Nations people, especially who might be listening, is in both the US and in Canada, for a variety of reasons, many of which I probably don't even know, the white man sought and worked very hard to eradicate the Indian, to remove them and remove their culture, put them in residential schools. They were forced in the residential schools to not speak their languages, to not practice their cultural, not practice their culture, not learn of their culture. No, all that has to go. What has happened, I'm now coming to this, I don't want to reverse all of that, which is one of the many reasons why I've been endeavoring to learn as many First Nations languages as I could the past year. Because my children's show, about 6 or 7 years ago, I think. I don't even honestly remember when this was, but I was in Sioux Lookout, Ontario at the time, and Sioux Lookout is this teeny tiny town in the middle of absolute nowhere in Ontario. And when I hired on with CN Rail and ran freight trains for 6.5 years, a job which I absolutely loved, as I look back now, even that job, that was God in action. I had to go and work for CN, and it had to be CN because CN had a crew change terminal in Sioux Lookout, Ontario, and there was no other reason why I would ever go to Sioux Lookout, Ontario. But Sioux Lookout, Ontario is where I had to go for what would happen next. So to give you an idea, Sioux Lookout is like 3,500 people, and the airport at Sioux Lookout, which includes the float plane base, it's the 4th busiest airport in the entire province of Ontario. So this little hick town. So why? And it's because there are dozens and dozens of these remote First Nations reserves all over the place in northwestern Ontario and over into Manitoba, which is not a far flight. And Sioux Lookout, they call it the hub of the North. It services all of these First Nations places, right? So they all fly to Sioux Lookout to go to the hospital, to go to the doctor, to get groceries, to take it back home. That's why there was all these gargantuan motels and a huge hostel over at the hospital. It's because you've got hundreds and hundreds of people coming in and out of this little itty bitty town all the time. And everything, of course, is sort of surrounds that, right? So it's all First Nation stuff in the town. And I had to go to Sioux Lookout. I had to be there for a while. This wasn't like, oh, I'll go speak at the church, be there for a week, and then I'll leave, and then I'll come back in another year. No, I had to go there. I had to live there. While I was there.
How long were you there?
5 years. So while I was there, I was still producing Genesis Week, but I had the desire to really go back to my days at Hyla and teach science and technology. I really just had this driving desire to do that. And I did an experiment with an online course, and it's teaching robotics, which is what I went to school for, right? And that's one of the main things I taught at the science camp was electronics, electromechanics, and robotics. And so I put the science and tech program that I had developed at Hyla, I just put it into an online course format, and it sold like hotcakes. It went through the roof. I think I had $5,000 in sales, course sales, the first month that I started it. Like it was totally unexpected. It was a huge experiment, but that led to a whole pile of talking back and forth with Wayne, because I was looking at all these new cool technologies. I'm like, man, if we had only had this when we were running Hyla, because him and Carol had retired, of course. And
So you reconnected with them then? You reconnected with them at this time? You reconnected with Wayne? Okay.
Yeah. And so out of the blue one afternoon, he sends me an email. He says, hey, I'd like you to consider rebooting Hyla, the science camp. I'm serious. Give me a call. And so I did. I gave him a call the next day. We had a conference call with him and Carol. And what he shared with me was not at all what I expected. He was talking about these, instead of running it as a summer camp, do short, high-intensity workshops. And to this day, no, I still don't see anybody doing what he suggested. And the moment I heard it, I'm like, you know what? You're on to something here. And so I ran an experiment in this little hick town, 3,000, 3,500 people. And I just did an all-day workshop on introduction to electricity and electronics with a focus on robotics. It was packed. And while I was advertising it, this is one of the tips Carol gave me. She said one of the best sources of advertisement for them, by far and away, was setting up a table in the halls of the local shopping mall. That got them more campers than any other method of advertisement. Now, we didn't have a mall in Sioux Lookout. We had Johnny's, the grocery store, right? And they let me set up a table. So I set up a table there and had one of my big mobile robots sitting on the table there that I had built for my online course as part of the teaching. And this lady walks up to me and asks me what I'm doing, what this is about, and I explain it all. And she's like, I'm charged with bringing educational programs like yours to the remote First Nations reserves. Might you be interested in that? And I was kind of like, well, sure, I guess. I mean, I hadn't even thought that far ahead. This was just a huge experiment. I didn't even know if it was going to work, if it was going to succeed or not, right? And it was a huge success. And so I got her name and number, and then 4 moves and a global pandemic later, I lost all that information. But anyway, I'll come back to that. So I ran the workshop, and it was packed. I limited it to 10 kids, and I got 9. And one of the guys there was an older gentleman. He brought 4 of his grandkids to the workshop. He came along, and we all had a blast. He was the counselor at a First Nations residential high school on the outskirts of Sioux Lookout that I didn't even know was there. And after the workshop, he's like, you need to come to this high school and do this workshop. And so they paid me to come do that. And I went there for a day, which cost an awful lot of money because CN pays through the nose. And it meant I was taking the train to Winnipeg, right? Which is, well, anyway, it was a lot of money. So we did that, had a blast. The one teacher was doing after school robotics club with the students, right? And they lived there. This was a residential high school. They had dormitories and everything. So all of this is going on. At the same time, I've been working on this children's show since at least 2013 is when it was really first put on my heart. While I was in Sioux Lookout, like I said, it's myself and 5 super genius kids, right? What I really believe the Lord laid on my heart was that one of those kids was a First Nations kid from the remote reserves of Northwestern Ontario. And that kid, to this day, because my writers and I still haven't worked this through, other than myself, that kid is the only kid in the entire show that actually has any character development. And so that kid I want as many First Nations children in the whole country to live vicariously through that kid in the show. That kid is an outreach. So even though First Nations children might make up probably 0.8% of the Canadian population, 20% of my show is specifically geared towards First Nations children, if you can follow that. And so when the plan was, when I quit CN and moved back out east, I would do these science and tech workshops. That would be my new livelihood. And so I started what I called the Tech Valley Science Center. And that was where I was going to operate my science and tech education programs out of. And so originally my children's show, I was going to call it Creation Exploration. We would explore God's creation with the inventions that the kids made. That was the principle behind the show. And Jeff Thiessen, he's the station manager at Miracle Channel, which airs my show here in Canada. Jeff has decades under his belt of children's television productions. So what he says to me is gospel truth. So we're talking on the phone after because they're trying to set up sort of like a Christian Netflix for kids with Miracle Channel. And so we were talking on the phone. He's really supportive. He really wants my kids show on their network. And he was asking me questions. He's like, well, what are you calling it? I said, Creation Exploration. He just sat there for a second. What? No, that's awful. No, absolutely not. Come up with something else. Oh, okay. Well.
So what did he come up with something?
I did.
So
Oh, you did?
About it.
Okay.
What's that?
I said, you did or he did?
No, I did.
Okay.
I went away and prayed about it. I'm like, you know what? The Tech Valley Science Center would probably be the best name. It's descriptive of what the program is. It makes like a home base for the kids and for myself. It's an animated series. It works. So it's a bit of a long name, but it works. And so as it turns out, I've now gotten connected in with that lady I met at the grocery store. I've now gotten connected in with that network, that educational network. I'll show you guys. I was thinking it was going to be like a couple of dozen schools, right? Which is a lot. It's not something to shake a stick at. So anyway, when I did reconnect with her this past year, she sends me to the website, and this is a map of the schools in the network. It's 155 schools and reserves all across the entire country, including, you can even see way up here, like almost at the North Pole, literally. So some of the programs I want to do. What's that?
The Shore Haven, is that what that is?
No, that one is Grease Fjord.
Okay.
I think this one's Eureka. I'd have to go back and look. I flunked geography in high school, by the way, just so you know. The only reason I even know these places is because I was looking at them on the map.
Yeah.
So, but I'm now officially onboarded, and we're working through. So this is all because you can see how remote these places were. And so what they did was they put together this high-speed bidirectional video link, which I believe was satellite originally. And they've got this gigantic screen TV in the classrooms, and they get teachers literally from all over the world, right? And so that's part of where all this comes in. So this is all through, this is the Tech Valley Science Center. So here I was going to be promoting my children's show with the science and tech education programs. That was the hopes. And also promoting the science and tech education programs through the children's show. And now I wind up in this absolutely monstrous network. And it's a really, like, I'm really impressed already just with what little I know. The onboarding process took me the entire day. It was hours and hours and hours of really informative, talking about the history of the First Nations peoples, and again, this tragic, the removal of the Indian, to virtual extinction. So what I want to do, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to give a shameless plug. So currently we're working on trying to make the kids program. So here's Tony the T-Rex hiding in behind the sign. This is one of the buildings. We've got our nuclear power plant off to the right side here. The hangar for the Chrono Commuter, which is a time and space traveling machine, is off to the left, as well as a big hangar for all the inventions and whatnot. So, but givesendgo.com/Tech Valley, that's the fundraiser. We're trying to kick it off because I actually have a writing team, which I've never had before in my life. I've got artists, which I've never had before in my life, 3D artists and whatnot. So that's where the children's program is. We've kind of just kicked off the fundraising, so we're just trying to get to work on that. And so that Tony the T-Rex, the kids actually, they find preserved dinosaur soft tissues under the microscope. They manage to extract DNA from it, and they invent a 3D bioprinter. And it's quite comical, the whole invention of that and the testing and failure and testing and everything. And they 3D print Tony the T-Rex, and he becomes the main character in the show about episode 5 or 6. So anyway, so sorry, Doug, you're flagging me down for time.
Yeah, we're getting close to time, but I wanted to ask you, is this going to be in Chalk River where you live?
Yes.
Yeah, the actual physical place is in Chalk River. Now, mind you, it was going to be the workshops are going to be all over the place. I basically rent facilities and go run the workshop somewhere else. So, and that way it doesn't restrict me to just little old Chalk River. I can go down to Ottawa.
So is the Tech Valley thing, does that interface with the animation thing? How does that, are you just two separate things?
It's two entirely separate things.
Now the animation thing, that's going to talk about creation stuff, or what's it going to talk about? Okay, and is it going to relate it to First Peoples or First Nation? Is it going to relate it to some of their stuff, or is this totally creation from the biblical perspective?
That's the part I didn't get to yet.
Yep. We're running out of time. We got to do another show, man. I don't know what.
I know.
You've been going. You've been really going. Yeah.
It's the one kid
In the show who's the First Nations kid, which
Yes.
I can, if we want to do another show, I can explain that, because it actually ties into last week's topic of artificial intelligence, because I actually used AI in helping to develop that character and stuff.
Has you got scripts for your animation show yet, or?
Yeah, I've got several scripted. I actually did a lot of principal videography in 2014 because originally it was going to be live action. And so I was filming in the Badlands of Alberta. I found a beautiful fossil dinosaur leg bone. It was awesome. It was probably one of the best fossils I've ever seen in the Badlands. And so I did a bunch of principal videography there that year. And then since that time, again, Jeff Thiessen was the one who kind of triggered me to switch to animation. So I'll still use those scenes. Have you guys seen any of the Amazing World of Gumball cartoon series?
No.
Well, we got to wrap up, I'm afraid, Ian.
Although we started a little bit later, though, don't you think?
Yeah, well, but anyway, I think that we'll continue this, and we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.